It started with a bet and a board that wasn't even square. Jenkins leaned on the fence post, chewing a stem of grass like he owned the dirt under his boots. "Ain't no way you frame a bunkhouse in under a week," he said, voice flat with heat and skepticism. "Not out here. Not with this crew. Not with that wood." He nodded at the stack of warped lumber baking in the sun. Eli Harper didn't argue. He just set the first beam down like it was a loaded promise, brushed the sweat off his brow, and tapped the corner with his hammer. 4 days, Eli said. Start to finish, framed, floored, roofed. The laughter came easy. Jenkins snorted loud enough for the wind to carry. Rourke chuckled behind his gloves. Even the ranch hands stopped moving long enough to grin. Not one of them had ever seen a full bunkhouse go up in less than 8 days, not unless you cut corners, and Eli wasn't known for that. But Eli wasn't building this one like the last. He walked the perimeter, slow, boots crunching in dry soil, marking each post hole not with a guess, but with notches he'd pre-measured a week before. He had the whole thing mapped out in his head, the wall lengths, the rafter angles, the spacing of each floor beam, no nail wasted, no board trimmed twice. That first morning, they watched him work like a man laying down railroad. No hesitation, no shouting, just motion, precise, practiced, quiet. He moved lumber like it had weight but no resistance, laid out joints that locked like teeth, and started a rhythm that made even the seasoned cowboys stop pretending they weren't curious. "Where's the saw?" Jenkins finally asked by noon. "Don't need it," Eli said, snapping a mortise joint into place with 2 taps. "Everything's already cut." The men glanced at the timber pile. Sure enough, each beam was marked dovetails, lap joints, pre-bored pegs already hammered halfway in. Not a single wild edge, not a splinter needing cleanup. "What in hell?" Rourke muttered. But Eli was already lifting the second corner post. He had a pulley rig fixed to a mesquite trunk, counterweighted with a bucket of horseshoes and old nails. It rose slow but smooth, no grunting, no slipping. 2 ropes, 1 man. Frame by frame, it came together like a story already told. By sundown, the entire skeleton stood 4 walls, squared and level. The sun dropped behind the ridge, and the last beam slotted in like a key in a lock. Rourke stared at the frame and finally said what everyone was thinking. "That ain't normal." Eli shrugged, eyes calm, voice quiet. "I didn't come to build the way y'all always did. I came to build the way I should have the first time." They didn't understand yet, but by the time he hung the roof, they would. Before he ever raised a beam on Harper Ridge, Eli spent a year building shacks that weren't meant to last. Border barracks, war camps, refuge huts in the dry valleys south of Del Rio, where the sun cracked boards before they were nailed and the wind stripped canvas roofs before you could name the storm. He hadn't gone looking for that work, it found him when the ranch went belly up and the banks took what his father left. Down there, it wasn't about craft. It was about survival. And fast. Every job started the same. Bad wood, worse tools, no time. They built with what they had, not what they wanted. That's where he met Miguel El Diente Ramos, a man who built houses with 2 hands, no saw, and a system no one could explain until they saw it work. Miguel didn't speak much English, but he knew how to build a frame tight enough to take a storm and quick enough to move on before the dust settled. Eli didn't talk. He watched, and he learned. The secret wasn't in the wood, it was in the prep. Every cut Miguel made was on the ground. Every board labeled before it touched a wall. Joints carved with a chisel, not hacked with a saw. Instead of measuring each beam when the post went up, he measured everything before the first hole was dug. Then he laid it out like a skeleton, every piece notched, tagged, and ready. No guesswork, no second cuts. "Build it like a song," Miguel said once, tapping his chest. "You don't hum when the crowd's watching, you hum when no one's listening. That's when the rhythm comes." Eli carried that rhythm home. So when the ranch hired him to build a new bunkhouse, he didn't just accept the job, he rewrote it. He spent 2 weeks in the workshop before he ever touched the field. Cut every rafter, carved every notch, made a scribing jig from mule bone and cedar marked with red iron chalk, drilled pilot holes for every dowel, created his own pegs set shaved, smooth, oiled with linseed, measured to swell with moisture and lock themselves in. No one saw it coming. That's why on the ridge, The frame rose like it had been waiting underground for someone to uncover it. Every timber matched its mate. Every angle fit like breath in the lungs. The cowboys watching didn't understand, but Eli wasn't building for them. He was building for time, for storms. For the kind of silence you need to trust the roof above your head when thunder rolls in. By the end of day 2, the frame was done. Rafters set, joists pinned, nothing splitting, nothing sagging. And still, he hadn't swung a saw once. They thought it was magic. How the walls just rose. How the boards clicked in like they'd been made by a machine. But there was no sorcery in it, only foresight. The kind of careful preparation that no one ever sees until it's already too late to copy. Eli's system didn't use nails, not the way most men did. Nails bend, nails rust. Nails split wood when the grain's dry and the air is wrong. He'd seen it in the war shelter's walls collapsing when they shrank in the heat, pulled apart by their own fasteners, so he stopped relying on them altogether. Instead, he built joints that wanted to hold. Every board was cut weeks earlier using a pattern jig he carved himself. He'd drawn it from memory, based on the old timber frame churches his grandfather once helped rebuild in Virginia. Mortise and tenon, lap joints, scarf joints with pegs, dovetails for stability. Even his floor beams were notched and locked, not nailed. Where others saw extra effort, Eli saw longevity. He laid it out on the ground behind his shed, the entire bunkhouse, every wall, beam, and joint assembled once in silence, then taken apart piece by piece. Each timber was branded with a number and a letter burned into its edge, a map, a code. When it came time to build, all he had to do was follow the song in reverse. "You don't need to fasten it," he told Charlie Jenkins, who stood slack, jawed as the east wall slotted together without a single nail. "If it's cut right, it holds itself." "But nails are faster," Charlie said. Eli shook his head. "Fast ain't what you think. Fast is building once and never fixing it again." By mid-morning, the bunkhouse had walls. By afternoon, it had a floor. Eli laid tongue-and-groove planks across the beams with nothing but a mallet and a block of pine. Each one tapped in, sealed tight, no squeaks, no gaps. The boards swelled slightly in the sun, exactly as he'd planned. No air would creep up through those seams come winter. The others stopped asking questions. They just watched. And they started to remember the last bunkhouse. The one they built with speed and nails, the one that shook every time the wind hit the eaves. The one that took twice as long and still had a draft you could feel in your bones. That night, Eli worked by lantern light. Not because he was behind, but because he was ahead. The shelter was dry. The frame didn't sway, and in the soft glow of oillight, he looked not like a builder but like a man who'd already lived through the future and come back with instructions. The ridge wind was up by dawn, not enough to tear a roof, but enough to make a man reconsider lifting a rafter beam without a crew. Most cowboys would have waited for calmer weather or more hands. Eli Harper didn't wait. He had something better than bodies. He had leverage. That morning, Jenkins showed up early, chewing coffee grounds and dragging his boots like the disbelief hadn't worn off yet. He stood there with his arms folded, watching Eli hoist a 20-foot beam into the air with one rope, one pulley, and not a grunt of effort. "What in God's name?" Jenkins murmured. Eli didn't answer. He just gave the rope one final tug, guided the beam into its notch with the edge of his boot, and stepped back as it settled with a deep, satisfying thud. Behind him, the pulley swayed gently, hooked to a mesquite trunk older than the town itself, rigged with iron brackets Eli had salvaged from a broken windmill. It looked makeshift, but it was stable, anchored deep, and braced from 3 sides. The counterweight system? 2 sacks of gravel and a cast-iron stove frame tied tight with leather harness straps. He'd built it weeks before the first board was cut. "Most folks lift with backs," he said quietly, "but the earth pulls just fine if you know how to let it." Jenkins shook his head. "You really built a crane for a bunkhouse?" Eli smiled slightly. "Built a crane so I wouldn't need 6 men watching me break my ribs. And that's what it was. While others bragged about their muscle, Eli engineered a system that made brute force irrelevant. 1 man on the pulley, 1 on the guide rope, sometimes a third to steady the beam if they were feeling generous. No shouting, no strain, just quiet clicks of timber finding its place. By mid-morning, the rafters were up, 6 of them. Each one slid into their sockets like a puzzle piece, held with peg joints and wedge blocks pre-cut to compensate for shrink. Not a creak. Not a groan. Just structure tight, true, still. 2 men did what 8 couldn't, Rourke said, finally stepping forward. Never seen it, Eli shrugged. Seen too many roofs sag in year 2. I'd rather spend a day building tools than spend a year fixing mistakes. By noon, folks stopped watching with suspicion. They started asking real questions. How'd you know the beam wouldn't swing? What weight do you use? What's holding the rig? Eli answered each one without hesitation, like he'd rehearsed this build 100 times in his sleep. Because maybe he had. Not just this structure, but the idea of doing it better, faster, not for ego, but for safety, for sense. That afternoon, a young hand from down valley tried the pulley himself. He lifted a ridge beam and set it in place with 2 fingers and a grin that didn't fade even when the rope burned his palm. You make it look easy, he said. Eli gave a small nod. It is, when you build like time matters. The ridge had gone quiet by day 2. Not silent like before a storm, but respectfully quiet. The kind of quiet you give a man when you realize he might know something you don't. By noon, the skeleton of the bunkhouse had turned into a body. Rafters in place, joists tight, floor set firm, no loose boards, no gaps to trap wind. Just angles so clean they looked drawn by machine. That was the day they stopped laughing. Charlie Jenkins came down the hill, slow, coffee cup in hand but cold to the touch. No more smirks. Just steady steps toward the bunkhouse frame he'd mocked 48 hours earlier. He stopped at the threshold, toe-brushing the line between dirt and plank, and muttered, "Hell, he really did it." By then, word had spread. Ranch hands from 3 properties over had started wandering up just to watch. They leaned against trees, boots planted firm, eyes tracking every movement like churchgoers watching a miracle in progress. Eli didn't speak much. He worked, quiet, focused. 1 beam, 1 joint, 1 breath at a time. Rourke tried to offer help once stood too close, hands on hips. Need another hand with the east wall? Eli just nodded toward the pulley. Already lifted. Rourke stepped back and folded his arms. Well, I'll be damned. The speed wasn't frantic, it was composed. Eli wasn't in a rush. He just didn't waste anything, not movement, not words, not nails because he still hadn't used a single one. Instead, he fit boards the way a blacksmith folds steel, intentional, rehearsed. Every piece had a home, every cut had a reason. Every beam met another, not by force, but by design. By evening, the outer walls stood at full height. He'd even hung the door frame square, plumb, and level without a shim in sight. The roof planks lay stacked, ready for the next morning, all pre-measured, all marked. Jenkins stepped inside and ran a hand along the west wall. It was smooth, cold, but sealed tight. You could feel the air inside holding still. "This ain't a bunkhouse," he said. "It's a watch." Eli finally paused, just long enough to reply. "Then maybe it's about time folks learned how to keep one." There wasn't much more to say. The jokes stopped for good that night. No more smirks, no more wisecracks over dinner, just quiet respect and questions. The kind of questions cowboys only ask when they've run out of pride. How'd you scribe your joists so tight? What's the angle on those corner laps? Where'd you learn to build like that? Eli gave short answers. Clear ones. And then he went back to work. The moon rose over the ridge, casting long shadows through the frame. Inside, the air held steady, and the silence deepened not from doubt, but from awe. By the third morning, no one dared interrupt him. They still came to watch hands in pockets, hats low, boots scuffing the dirt, but they said less and listened more. Eli Harper moved through the half-finished bunkhouse like a man walking through memory, not a job site. Every beam he touched, every line he checked, felt like part of something he'd already built 100 times before. The noise that usually filled a build, grunts, curses, bad jokes, hammered nails, had been replaced by a kind of reverent hush. Dust floated in the morning light, and the sound of his mallet was the only music. The roof came next. Not a jumbled patch of warped shingles and poor math. No. Eli laid each board like he was folding a letter to God. The planks were bevel-cut and tongue-locked, each one slotted into its neighbor and sealed with waxed wool cord he'd prepped weeks earlier. It took time, but it saved more. No wind would get through, no drip would break in. Not this roof. Charlie Jenkins was there again, sitting on the stone pile with a pipe he hadn't lit in 2 days. "Don't even sound like work," he muttered, almost to himself. Rourke nodded, arms crossed. "Feels like watching a church go up." Inside, the bunkhouse, Eli worked in rhythm. He didn't check the level twice. He didn't measure the same cut 3 times. He'd already done that in his head. The real build happened long before the first board was touched. What the valley was seeing now was the quiet aftermath of precision. And that silence? It was earned. By afternoon, he had the roof sealed, the floor sanded, the door swinging true. And he still hadn't broken a sweat in panic, just the honest kind forehead, forearms, back, no frenzy, just discipline. A young ranch hand named Toby, barely 19, walked up at dusk with a wrapped biscuit in his hands. "Sir," he said, not even sure where the word came from. You build like my grandfather talked about, like they used to." Eli looked at the boy and simply nodded. "That's how I learned too, from someone who did it better than me." The boy handed him the biscuit. It was a peace offering, a thanks, an unspoken truth shared between generations. Eli took it, ate in silence, then wiped his hands and got back to work. No one told jokes that night. No one tried to rush him. They just stood a little straighter, leaned a little less, and made sure they weren't in his way. Because by now, even the most stubborn man on that ridge had come to understand. Eli wasn't just building a bunkhouse. He was building a lesson. And no one wanted to miss it. It wasn't flashy. Just a smooth, sanded stick of ash wood, about 2 feet long, with dark notches burned into the grain like scars. But everyone who saw Eli use it stopped and stared, because every line he marked with that tool seemed to land exactly where it needed to be. Not a hair off, not an inch wasted. They called it the stick at first. Thought it was just a straight edge, but it was more than that. It was the tool, and he never let anyone else touch it. It had no steel, no moving parts, no name carved into it. Just a curve at one end for grip and 5 notches across its spine, like tally marks counting something only Eli understood. At the base was a circle of iron inlay blacksmith made, hammered flush and polished from years of use. The surface was oiled to a soft sheen, and though it looked simple, it was calibrated tighter than any store-bought square. He made it by hand years ago, in the quiet after the last bunkhouse collapse. He didn't talk about that day much, but everyone knew the story how the ridge shelter fell in under a sudden freeze, trapping 4 men inside. One died, the others limped for months. Eli had helped dig them out. After that, he stopped building with guesswork. The tool was born in that silence. It wasn't just a gauge, it was a template, a pattern for every notch, beam length, peg spacing, and roof angle in this exact region. He'd carved it for prairie climate, softwood expansion, and storm runoff. It factored the sag of sod under snow and the way pine boards shrink in autumn. It told him where to cut without second-guessing, and it had never failed him. Jenkins once asked, "Let me see that thing, just for a tick." Eli looked at him for a long time, then replied, "You can watch it all day, but you don't borrow a compass if you don't know how to sail." That was enough. So they watched, closely. They saw how he placed the tool on a beam, dragged a chalk line without measuring, and then drilled or notched without even checking twice. They saw how every floorboard landed flush, how every rafter sloped just right to throw water clear of the foundation. They didn't know how it worked, but they knew it worked. That evening, Rourke pulled his hat low and muttered, "If that tool was a man, we'd be feeding it whiskey." May Henderson, quiet, always watching, just said, "That's not a tool, that's trust." Carved into wood. By sunset, the bunkhouse stood sealed from peak to plank. Eli packed the tool away in an oilcloth pouch, slid it into his satchel, and said nothing. But every man there felt it. The house might shelter the ranch hands, but that tool, it sheltered the man who built it. They came one at a time, pride slow to peel off their boots. The bunkhouse was done. Fully framed, floored, roofed, and sealed before the fourth sunset touched the edge of the valley. Eli didn't celebrate. He didn't even pause. He walked the perimeter one last time, tapping beams with his knuckles, listening for hollows. There were none, only tight joins, dry seals, and the quiet satisfaction of a thing done right. That's when Jenkins stepped forward. No jokes, no hat in hand, just his voice, quieter than anyone had ever heard it. "Eli," he said, "I was wrong." Eli didn't answer. Jenkins rubbed the back of his neck, then tried again. "What I mean is, I want to learn it, not just copy, not just the tool, the whole way." Behind him, Rourke cleared his throat. "I'd like my boy to learn it too. He's 16 now, got hands like his." Mother steady. May Henderson didn't speak. She just walked into the bunkhouse and ran her fingers along the grain of a rafter, nodding to herself like she was touching the inside of a promise. Eli leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. "You sure?" he asked. "About what?" Jenkins said. "That you don't just want the result, you want the reason, because this ain't a shortcut. It's a system, a discipline. It's built in the quiet weeks before anyone's watching. You gotta be patient enough to do the hard part in private." They stood there in the dust. Men who once mocked him now squinting into the light of something they'd never thought they'd ask for wisdom from a man who refused to cut corners. "How'd you learn it?" Rourke asked. Eli looked toward the ridgeline where the old collapsed shelter still stood in his memory, buried in silence. "Because one winter I buried a friend in a coffin made from boards that didn't fit. I never forgot the sound it made when I nailed the lid shut. That's why I build like this." No one said a word. Then Eli reached into his satchel, pulled out a thin strip of pine, not the tool itself but a copy of its edges. A tracing, the first pattern he'd ever made. He handed it to Jenkins. "Start with this, scribe your own." Not just the shape but the standard. Jenkins held it like a lit lantern. That night they didn't just talk, they listened. Eli sat at the bunkhouse table with the younger hands, Toby, Cal, even May's daughter Lila, and showed them how to mark grain lines by sunlight, how to gauge timber tension with a twist of the wrist, how to pre-drill for wood swell, how to feel for balance by weight alone. They took notes on feed bags and saddle parchment. But more than that, they watched. And in that lantern-lit room, for the first time in years, something deeper than shelter began to rise. A craft. A culture. A way of building that made every cut count because every cut was a choice. The old bunkhouse still stood just barely down past the cottonwoods, its roof collapsed like a busted ribcage, walls bent inward as if they were ashamed. No one went near it anymore. Not since the winter of '79, when the storm rolled in faster than the boys who built it had planned for. 3 of them made it out. One didn't, Eli remembered. He remembered the sound the walls made when the wind hit wrong hollow, loose, like teeth ready to fall out. He remembered how they'd used scrap wood and bent nails just to beat the clock. How they said, "We'll fix it better next spring." Spring never came for James Proctor. That was the winter Eli stopped building fast. Not because fast was bad, but because rushed was deadly. So when people asked why he built this new bunkhouse the way he did, with joints that clicked in like they were whispered into place, with pulleys and patterns and weeks of planning, he didn't give them the technical answer. He gave them the real one. "I don't build like this to impress anybody," he said that night, lantern light dancing across his face, shadows settling into the wrinkles carved by wind and regret. "I build like this because somebody trusted me to keep them warm, and I failed once." They didn't ask questions after that. May Henderson stood in the corner, arms crossed, watching her daughter run her fingers along one of the corner joints. "Is that why you always measure twice?" she asked softly. Eli gave a half smile. "I measure twice because the first time I didn't." The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was sacred. Rourke finally broke it. "You could have blamed the wood, or the weather, or the help, but you didn't." Eli shook his head. "Blame doesn't build better beams." That night the lesson shifted. It wasn't about tools or timber anymore. It was about intent, about the weight behind a hammer swing, the meaning inside a chalk line, the decision to plan, not because it's clever, but because it's kind. He pulled out a worn notebook, edges curled, pages stiff with old dust and sap stains. Inside were sketches, notes, diagrams, failures, lessons. Mistakes he'd never make again, not because he read it in a book, but because he'd lived through the consequences. He passed it across the table. Toby opened it like scripture. Cal read every note aloud like it might save him. And maybe it would. Because the trick wasn't a shortcut. It was a philosophy. Build like the roof might have to hold when no one else shows up. Build like the people inside are worth more than your convenience. Build like you'll be the one sleeping under it when the next storm hits. That's what Eli had learned, and that's what he passed on. They didn't frame it, they didn't laminate it, or hang it on a wall. The blueprint wasn't a scroll, or a drawing, or a blueprint at all. It was a memory, a rhythm, a story passed down from one hand to another, not through paper, but through timber, time, and the feel of a tool worn smooth by purpose. By week's end, the bunkhouse stood sealed, solid, and still. No squeaks, no draft. No bowing ridge beams or nail heads peeking where they didn't belong. It didn't creak at night. It didn't moan in wind. It rested like a thing that knew it had been made right. Folks came by, even from the next county over. They didn't come to inspect, they came to learn. May's boys walked the perimeter with rope and charcoal, tracing beam angles in the dust. Jenkins brought his nephew and stood quiet as the kid took notes. Rourke sent word to his cousin down in Crockett that there was a build worth copying on the Harper Ridge. Even the old preacher stopped by and said it looked more like a chapel than a shelter. But Eli didn't preach. He just nodded and showed them what he'd done, where he buried the trench for runoff, how he spaced the floor joists to swell tight after a rain. Why? The door was hung off center to shield it from the prevailing wind. He walked them through the invisible parts, the kind that made the biggest difference, the planning parts. This here, he said, tapping a crossbeam, ain't strong because of its size. It's strong because of what came before it. Toby asked what he meant. Eli pointed to the grain. This wood was cut in the fall. It's dry, tight, and true. You can't slap together spring lumber and expect it to hold through winter. Cal added, so it's about when, not just how. Eli smiled. Exactly. The lesson stuck. Not just the joints and jigs, but the mindset. Build before the storm. Think past the first season. Don't just build fast, build forever. One by one, the ranchers headed home. But they carried something with them that weighed more than tools. It was the sense that you could build a thing that didn't need fixing. A thing that stood on its own, not because it was easy, but because it was earned. In the months that followed, 3 bunkhouses were built using Eli's method. A stable, a feed barn, even a schoolhouse porch. They weren't identical, but each bore the marks, the angled joints, the locked beams, the quiet strength of something that didn't rely on nails to hold together. And in every one of those places, someone said the same thing. This build? It's got Eli's rhythm. Eli never claimed credit, he just kept working. But when the next hard season came, and the winds howled over the ridge like they always did, those new bunkhouses didn't creak. They held. Because the blueprint wasn't a drawing, it was a choice. And now, it belonged to everyone willing to make it.